Hey guys, Bryan here from Liquid Concepts. So today we're going to talk a little bit about prep work. And so of course you've seen a couple of other videos, and we normally of course will recommend using the sandblaster. So I've had a couple of requests and wanted to shoot a quick little video to show you guys what can you use for prep work besides a sandblaster, because of course not everybody may have a sandblaster, or maybe sometimes you might even have a part that may not fit in the blaster. So what kind of prep work are we going to be needing to do with the Hydrographics to make sure that we get a good coating starting out? And so a lot of that is going to come back to the sandpaper. Now I've got a couple of different sandpaper types here that is still going to work just fine for the most part. Now, one thing to make sure of is that, especially with, like, for instance, metal is going to be one of those things where a blaster is always going to be a little bit better than just the sandpaper alone. But if this is all you have, then it will still work. But as far as long-term durability, you may see a slight difference just because maybe you can't get the sandpaper inside little corners or crevices or things like that. So that is where the sandblaster does really help out. But if you don't have that, then let's talk about what all you're going to need to get things going for the prep work on the Hydrographics. So whenever you get in any job, whether it be wood or metal or plastic or anything like that, most of the time you're going to be prepping out the same with a very similar grit sandpaper, whether it be any one of those substrates. And so the first thing is going to be with wood. So with wood, we're going to be using anywhere between a 220 grit to a 320 grit sand scratch. Now again, we are using a sealer as a primer, so therefore it is a thinner coating. So if you do need to do any body work or anything like that, get some gouges or scratches or anything like that out, you may have to adjust that. You could even go down to maybe a 180 or anything like that, but we're normally using about a 220 to 320 grit sand scratch. And so of course with wood, we're actually not putting that in our blaster just to make sure that we don't have any problems with that down the road, because of course with a sandblaster you can really hurt wood products, so definitely don't want to put those in there unless you have the right media for that substrate. So moving along into metal. So let's say that we get a gun in. So we already have a wooden gun stock, and now we need to prep out the metal. So the metal, especially with the sandpaper, we may have to drop down with our sandpaper grit, so that way we can make sure that we get a good sand scratch on the metal itself. So I have heard of some customers using 80 grit. I don't really recommend that. Now again, if you have an application that you feel like is necessary, then of course I understand. But for us, most of the time, we're gonna be somewhere around the 180 to 220 grit. And so because metal is so hard, it does take a little bit more of a grit to really get a good sand scratch, because inevitably, just like with the wood, it's going to take it off a lot quicker. But with metal, you're not taking it off a lot quicker, so you do need a little bit bigger grit to help gouge that surface, so then that way you get a really good bond between your primer and your base coat. So that also brings us to our third substrate. So the other substrate would be plastics. So again, with plastics, you can definitely blast those, which we do recommend. But if you don't have the blaster, usually we're going to be going back to the same thing like what we were doing with the wood, and using somewhere around maybe a 220 to 320 grit sandpaper. So that way we get a really good scuff, and we're able to get everything prepped out correctly. So that way we can apply first maybe our adhesion promoter or our primer, whichever one we're using depending on the application. So as you can clearly see, most everything is going to get somewhere around maybe a 180 to a 320 grit sand scratch. And so of course we have all different kinds of grits, anywhere from 80 all the way up to 3000 and even 5000 grit. But whenever you're starting out, you definitely want to have something for that coating to bond into. And of course, if you don't have the sandblaster, then the sandpaper is normally the next best thing, and that gives you a really good sand scratch, so that way everything bonds really well to that substrate, and it makes it to where you have a very long lasting durable coating, and not just one that'll only last just maybe a few months. Sandpaper does definitely come in different sizes and different cuts, as well as different grits. And so what I have here is a couple of different grits as well as different colors from maybe a different manufacturer, and even on a roll like this. And so depending on what you have, whether you have maybe just your hands and you're using your hands to scuff the part, or maybe you have a DA or something like that, like a random orbital or anything like that, those will all dictate what type of sandpaper that you're going to need. So you can still get, say, 320 grit in a roll like this. You can also get 320 grit in a roll like this, where maybe it's a 6-inch DA, and then you can also even get it with the holes in it if it has maybe a vacuum system or something like that. So depending on which method that you're going to be using to sand the parts down with will of course determine which way that you need to get for your sandpaper that you're going to be buying. One thing to definitely keep in mind is that not all sandpaper is created equal. Of course, there is tons of different brands out there, from 3M to Mirka to all other different brands, and we have used a lot of them. Now, of course, they do have different grades of the quality of the sandpaper. So if you're wanting to make sure that you can use maybe one piece of sandpaper for a lot more jobs, then maybe using the higher end brand that they have will be a lot better. But if you're maybe like us and we might use this one piece one time and then we need to move on to a different piece or a different grit, then we need more of a disposable system. And so we need just more of a cheaper grit sandpaper. And so definitely look at a lot of those different grades of sandpaper, because depending on your application will of course depend on your budget, as well as whether it's going to have a lot better build quality on the actual sandpaper itself. And of course you can read all about that on the manufacturer's websites or by calling them and things like that. But those are a few things to definitely keep in mind. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video. I know it was short, I know it was quick, but if you don't have a sandblaster and you're wondering what all you can use to help prep out other items, then the sandpaper is definitely the next best thing, in my opinion, on making sure that everything gets 100% prepped out, ready to go, and you're giving your customers and yourself a really good coating that's going to last a very long time. And this is where it all starts, is in the prep work. So if you have any questions or comments, definitely leave them below. We'd always love to hear from you, as well as hit the like and the subscribe button. We'd always love to have you subscribe to our weekly tips and tricks on anything hydrographics related. Check out the website. It has tons of information, as well as anything that you would need for the hydrographics, from tanks to training to film, activator, paints, clear coats. Everything is all there on the website. We're gonna have links in the description, so that way you can check those out. I'm Bryan from Liquid Concepts, and this is how we customize your world. We'll see you guys next time.